On to this, the General Federation of Trade Union Educational Trust, Trade Union and Working History Series. Yeah, I managed to say that in one word. Obviously in partnership with the March Memorial Library and the Working Class Movement Library here. Yeah. So those people who don't know me, my name is Bob Kelly, and I'm a trustee here at the library. Just a couple of little things about housekeeping. Before we start, if you need the loo, it's at the back there. If you're a bit shy about going to the toilet there, there's the toilets inside the library if you want to use it. Yeah. There's tea and coffee at the back if you need to drink and water and stuff. If the fire alarm goes off, then obviously out the door here, and we just congregate just outside the gate by the car park. Can just have a little word off phones if possible as well. And make sure your phones are switched off or on silent, because they can be really annoying when people are talking. Yeah, okay. So let's talk about how the event will work tonight. So this is a hybrid event. So as well as people in the room here, we've got people on Zoom. For those people who are online, means you can see us, but you can't see each other, by the way. And if you want to comment, make comments or ask questions, then feel free to use the chat button. But there's also a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and you can ask that questions there. And what will happen is Nathan will cut and paste them, and we'll read them out for you. Yeah, okay. Obviously, for those people in the room who want to ask a question, it's the old traditional way. You should put your hand up. Yeah, okay. So tonight is the fourth session in this year's programme, and the topic of discussion tonight, much neglected topic of discussion in trade union history, is the period 1910 to 1920, from syndicalism to revolution, and we're very lucky to have both Professor Mary Davis and Professor Darlington here tonight to talk to us about it. So what we're going to do, we're going to give Mary about 45 minutes together. Talk about the issue, and then we'll give some time for people to ask questions. Yeah, is that okay? We're hoping not to finish no longer than our 8:30. Okay. Yeah, okay. Just to mention up just now, if you'll recall, we'll be following the educational trust behavioural statements, which people online can find in the chat. But I think we'll just now, it's just a question of people understanding that we all respect each other in the room, we let people speak, etc. You know, everyone takes the turn when we put their hand up. Yeah, okay. So. Let me introduce our speakers. So our first speaker is Professor Darlington, who is the Emeritus Professor of Employment Relations at Salford University. Yeah. Ralph has been around quite a long time, talking about industrial relations, and he seems to be around for ages for me. Talking about, writing about industrial relations, dynamics of trade union organisation, and trade union history. My particular favourite book of Ralph's is the Dynamics of Workplace Unionism, and that's one of my favourites, Ralph, is because all the three workplaces that you researched today all have relatives of mine working there. And I also knew quite a few of the characters that you interviewed in as well. Yeah. The other book that he's written recently is The Labour Revolt in Britain, which obviously covers part of the period that we're talking tonight. And Ralph has brought a couple of copies here, by the way, and he's willing to sell you for a tenner if you want one, yeah. Okay. And I've just finished reading that book, and I'll recommend it. After this video, if you want to learn a bit more about the subject we're talking about, then please look at it. And our second speaker tonight is Professor Mary Davis. And Mary is, as well as being a labour historian, she's also being a trade union activist. She writes lots of stuff from a Marxist perspective on women's history, labour history, imperialism, etc. And I'm going to mention one of her books, which is Comrade or Brother. Yeah? Question mark? Yes. Okay. And that I've been teaching labour history for a long time. It's always one of the main texts of my courses. And if anyone comes to the trade union history course that we've got, we're running here in January, we'll be using that book quite a lot. She's also serves on the that's a long one. She also serves on the Northern Star Management Committee, the Sylvia Pankhurst Memorial Committee, and is secretary of the March Memorial Library. She's, after all that, she's found that. Okay, so without further ado, Ralph, do you want to start proceedings?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Comrades, I mean, during the first 2 decades of the 20th century, amidst a really extraordinary international upsurge in strike action, the ideas of revolutionary syndicalism connected with and helped to build mass workers' movements across the world. Amongst the largest, most famous of the unions that were associated with syndicalism were, of course, the, excuse my pronunciation, but a lot ago, the Confédération Générale du Travail, France, the Confédération Nacional de Trabajo in Spain, and the Unione Sindicale Italiana. I mean, in France, syndicalism, for a time at least, was the majority tendency inside the labour movement in terms of syndicalist influence, as it was in Ireland, the Irish Transport Truck and Workers' Union. In most other countries, syndicalism was a minority, a significant minority phenomenon. For example, in America, with the industrial workers of the world, or the bottlers as they were colloquially known, or indeed here in Britain, during the pre-war Industrial Syndicalist Education League, and then in a more diffuse form inside the shop stewards and workers' committee movement. Now, I mean, the heyday of revolutionary syndicalism really was maintained only a brief period of time. The seizure of state power by the Bolsheviks, by the subsequent formation of the Communist International and its trade union arm, the Red International of Labour Unions. This was to prove a decisive ideological and political challenge to syndicalism. And although it remained a residual thought in Europe up until the Second World War, the fact is it was merely a pale shadow of its former self. It was really displaced partly by the rejuvenated social democracy, but also by the establishment of communist parties around the world, which rapidly supersede syndicalist organisations in most countries. The only important exception, of course, being the influence of the anarcho-syndicalist CNT during the Spanish Civil War. But I think it's probably difficult to think of any other tendency inside the labour movement during the 20th century, whose historical moment was so brief as was syndicalism. But even if short-lived and ultimately unsuccessful, particularly when you compare it with the architects of the Russian Revolution, I would argue that it nonetheless made a very significant contribution, not only in terms of encouraging workers' struggles, but in terms of its notions of revolutionary unionism, its antipathy towards capitalism, its exploration of the ways in which workers could have some forms of democratic self-control, I think made an important contribution. What I want to do is briefly look at the philosophy of syndicalism, obviously in Britain. Then I'm going to look in turn at the role of the Industrial Syndicalist Education League and then at the Shop Stewards and Workers' Committee movement, and then I'm going to end up with a few comments about the limitations and the tensions within the syndicalist tradition, which I think help explain the transition to communism that would ultimately come about. Of course, if we look at Britain, we're talking about syndicalism being intimately connected with the activities of the legendary labour leaders Tom Mann. Mann, of course, had come to national prominence as one of the leaders of the 1889 London dock strike, and then he was a leader of the Broken Hill miners' strike in Australia in 1908. He came back to Britain in the middle of 1910, amidst the massive wage strikes that swept the country, the so-called labour unrest, what I've termed the labour revolt, that occurred between the years of 1910 to 1914. And it's in this context that he establishes the newspaper, The Industrial Syndicalist, which became known as the Syndicalist, and founded the body, the Industrial Syndicalist Education League. And the League really advocated a number of key features. First of all, uncompromising class war against capitalism, that it could only be resolved through the revolutionary overthrow. The rejection of parliamentary democracy and the idea that social reform could be gradually introduced from above, instead, in favour of, if you like, trade union and militant working class struggle, and insistence that society transformation could only come about through revolutionary activity from below, through workers' own self-organisation and a point of production. They took a position of autonomy from political parties and indeed political action, and in a sense, you can see how they reacted against the newly formed Labour Party, the Parliamentary Labour Party, and their apparent corruption by electoral politics, the way that they watered down their socialist principles, the way that they betrayed workers' struggles. The syndicalists reacted against this, although they also reacted against the orthodox Marxist organisation of the day, the Social Democratic Federation, again known as the British Socialist Party, because of its sterile, sectarian sort of propagandist insistence on political action as being the key means to advance society. And instead, doing what syndicalists thought needed to be done, which is to invest trade union and workplace struggle with revolutionary significance. And as a consequence of this, we can see the way that syndicalism reacted, not just to political parties, but to the notions of political action as well. Crucially, of course, syndicalists believed in industrial unionism. In other words, in recognition of the limitations of the perceived existing craft, sectionalist, bureaucratic and conservative unions, what the syndicalists advocated was their reconstruction towards an all-embracing industrial form of organisation, which would come about through a process of amalgamation and revolutionary transformation within. And in this sense, the Industrial Syndicalist Education League adopted the sort of French style tactic of boring from within the existing unions, rather than adopting their American counterparts in the Waddlist tradition of dual unionism and building separate revolutionary unions outside of the existing organisations and in competition with them. They saw the trade unions not only as an agency of class struggle, as against employers in the here and now of the capitalism, but also saw them as the embryo of the future society, an organ of economic and industrial administration that would, after the overthrow of capitalism, take control over the means of production and establish a form of workers' control over industry and society. And finally, in this future society, they rejected the idea that there would be any need for a physical state apparatus. The only form of government, from the syndicalist point of view, would be the economic administration of industry, and this would be administered by workers themselves directly through their trade unions. Okay, so when it comes to the League itself, as I said, between the period of 1910 to 1914, the Great Strike Wave period, the fact is it only had a few thousand activists normally, but its influence was completely out of proportion to this in all sorts of ways. I'll give you some examples. I mean, the newspaper, for example, had a reach of up to 20,000 copies. Its conferences were attended by hundreds and hundreds of trade union militants and activists, with a claimed representation of about 150,000 workers. Tom Mann's tireless and powerful oratory at literally hundreds and hundreds of meetings during the strike ensured that there was widespread, an audience for the traditions of syndicalism, syndicalist practice and ideas. Mann, of course, was chairman of the famous 1911 Liverpool General Transport strike, with 66,000 workers. He was instrumental in helping to bring together a national federation, Transport Workers Federation, that brought together 15 hitherto separate waterfront unions. And many syndicalists were involved in the activities of the day. For example, the South Wales Miners Federation, people like Noah Abler formed an unofficial reform committee to fight against the bureaucracy of the unions and the militant policies. They produced a very famous pamphlet, The Miners' Next Step, which was a real statement of revolutionary unionism. In the railway industry, syndicalists were extremely active. They helped bring about the amalgamation of three hitherto different railway unions into one all-embracing, all-inclusive, all grades model industrial union, the National Union of the Railway, which of course is the form of today's RMT. And they were active in many other ways. Of course, in Ireland, it was the syndicalist influence of the and James Connolly, who spent about 2 years in America working with the Wobblies, who were to be profoundly influential inside the Irish and Transport General Workers' Union during the Dublin lockout sort of period. And syndicalist ideas were influential in the Plebs League, bobbing that fought for independent working class political education, inside the Daily Herald, which had a circulation of up to 100,000, and so on. And in many respects, syndicalism became a household name, denounced by the government, by the employers, and indeed by trade union and labour leaders. Well, although by the onset of the First World War, in August of 1914, the League had split and completely disintegrated, during and immediately after the First World War, really the syndicalist tradition continued, but it did so in a more diffuse and less organised fashion. But it did so inside a layer of skilled engineering shop stewards across the country, many of whom had been involved in pre-war battles themselves. And so from the period of 1915 to about 1920, you see, during the wartime period, an escalating level of strikes take place. And this encourages powerful forms of shop stewards organisation inside the strategically important engineering factories, which of course were producing munitions for the front. But it's not only shop stewards organisation in individual factories, there are then links and networks between these in different cities around the country. And of course, it's in the Clyde that you see, they form what are known as workers' committees. So you see the development of this, and it's in the Clyde, on the Clyde side, where this movement really takes off. An unofficial movement which acts in defiance of the full-time union machinery. And the Clyde Workers' Committee, of course, was to expand for the first time the principle of independent rank-and-file organisation. And I'm sure you'll be familiar with their very famous statement. We will support the officials just as long as they rightly represent the workers, but will act independently immediately they misrepresent them. And from the Clyde developed a national shop stewards and workers' committee movement. Similar forms of organisation in engineering sectors around the country, people places like Manchester, Coventry, Sheffield, and London, and so on. They have their own national newspaper, monthly paper, Solidarity. They have their own national delegate conferences. They have a national administrative committee. They played an influential role in the strike of 200,000 engineering workers right in the middle of the First World War in 1917. And an indication of the strength of this movement was the rapid sale of 150,000 copies of J.T. Murphy's very famous pamphlet, The Workers' Committee. By the way, both of these have been achieved by Strike Map, which not only developed a sophisticated critique of trade union officialdom, but also outlined a detailed blueprint for a national rank-and-file movement. Now, crucially, this Shop Stewards and Workers' Committee movement, in all intents and purposes, was led by people, some of whom were members of the socialist organisations of the day. I'm talking about people like Arthur McManus, Tom Bell, Willie Gallagher, J.T. Murphy. Many of them were not members of socialist organisations. They were independent militants, non-aligned politically, W.F. Watson, Jack Tanner, or whatever. But all of them, in one way or another, their theoretical outlook, their practical activity was very much influenced by the pre-war syndicalist tradition. This is why it's a tradition which carries over. Okay, well, I think Mary's going to look in more detail at the way that in in the period after the war, during, but particularly after the war, with a massive, I mean, if the Labour revolt of 1910 to 14 was a heightened period of strike wave, the revolt from 1919 to 20, was on a much higher level, much more political sort of level. It's in this context, amidst this struggle, the inspiration of the Russian Revolution and also the formation of the Communist International leads to a radical reorientation on the British left that culminates in the formation of the Communist Party of Great Britain in 1921. But of course, what's crucial is that many pre-war syndicalists and wartime syndicalists in 1920, sorry, 1920, many of the pre-war syndicalists and also wartime syndicalist influenced militants are won to communism. And here, for example, J.T. Murphy, Tom Mann, and so on and so forth. So what I want to do, though, is try to point towards some of the ways, some of the dilemmas, some of the tensions within the syndicalist tradition, which I think helps explain why there could be this transition to communism. First of all, I think there was the syndicalist assumption that the unions could be transformed into revolutionary organisations. Perhaps with the benefit of hindsight, it's clear that even though unions express and articulate the conflict between labour and capital, their purpose isn't to put an end to capitalism, but merely to seek better terms and conditions within the system itself. In other words, unions are both organs of containment as well as struggle. And another way of looking at this is to if we remind ourselves of the difference between a conception of unions as a movement, this is the way the syndicalists viewed it, that prioritises workplace resistance and direct democracy, membership mobilisation, and has radical economic and political aspirations on the one hand, with a conception of unions as an organisation which is enshrined in formal bureaucratic structures that prioritises institutional and financial excellence. And I think the problem with syndicalism is it came up against the limits of unionism in this respect. However, after the Bolshevik Revolution, the leaders of the shop stewards began to, having built these workers' committees, began to look at them and compare them with what existed in Russia with the establishment of Soviets. And to see in them a new agency of working class power and socialism. And I think this political discovery of the institutional form through which the working class could take control of society actually marked a decisive break with syndicalist notions that revolutionary change would occur through trade unions. Here was an alternative organ from the base that might be playing a crucial role. Secondly, there's a problem of how to confront bureaucratic trade union officials. And of course, the Industrial Syndicalist Education League certainly not only appreciated the problem of bureaucracy, but also tried to emphasise, you look at the Minus Next Step or the Workers' Committee pamphlets, they have a sophisticated critique of the problem with bureaucracy, but they also advocate the need for rank and file democracy, for decentralisation of union power, to try to assert control over the machinery of the union and so on. The problem is that the pre-war Syndicalist League really provided little coordinated rank and file organisation across unions and across England that might be able to challenge the officials. They were all in favour of struggle and encouraging rank and file militancy, but in terms of developing some mechanisms that would be effective to be able to usurp the power of the officials, this was lacking. And again, it's not until the wartime shop stewards movement that a way out of this dilemma, I think, is discovered. And of course, here, Murphy's pamphlet, The Workers' Committee, I think, marks quite a significant advance on the earlier Minus Next Step in seeking, in going beyond seeking to just reform trade unions in the direction of industrial unionism. To begin to advocate the need to develop both within and outside official union structures, rank and file organisations that will be able to act independently of those officials. In other words, what the syndicalists of the wartime period, or socialist influence by syndicalist ideas in the wartime period were moving from is away from the idea of merely using the unions or putting pressure on union officials to looking towards action in spite of them. Third, I think there's the question of industrial unionism, because here it seems to me there was a tension, the idea that somehow a change in the form of trade unionism would inevitably produce a transformation in its content. In other words, that it's through amalgamation and industrial unionism that this would automatically overcome the problem of sectionalism and the bureaucracy and the conservatism of union officialdom. But of course, actually, the proof was in the pudding, because when you looked at the role of the National Union of Railway, it was a fantastic achievement to build this industrial union, but the fact of the matter is it didn't lead to a quite union as was anticipated. It's still dominated by full-time officials, still proved as willing to compromise and behave responsibly in inverted commas as its sectionalist predecessors have. Then I think there's the question of leadership. The industrial syndicalist education, whilst it encouraged militant rank and file action from below, tended to recoil from the idea of providing practical day-to-day leadership itself inside the working class movement. And they did so because they believed that leadership, people who got into positions of power, and whatever, inevitably become corrupt. And therefore, they wanted to avoid this and to encourage action from below. And concentrate instead on the reconstruction of unions through industrial unionism. And as I mentioned, the wartime shop stewards movement did believe in rank and file organisation from below, and through shop stewards organisation. The problem is its own structures, the shop stewards and workers' committee structure, were very much on the pre-war syndicalist tradition lines. In other words, they're very amorphous, very diffuse, decentralised, very localised nature, and didn't provide a lead to its own supporters and militants inside the working class movement. And again, I think the experience of what was going on in Russia, which, as I'll come to, was to illustrate the limitations of that sort of position. There was the problem of the subordination of politics to industrial struggle. Here, it's not true that syndicalists were not political. They were inherently political in their desire to overthrow capitalism. The problem is that they assumed the solution to all political problems could be found on the picket line. That it's through industrial struggle that those differences could be overcome and wouldn't be allowed to divide workers and so on. In other words, industrial organisation of struggle was primary and political questions were something that was secondary. Of course, the problem with this, it meant that broader issues outside the sphere of economics and narrow trade union activity were then barely warranted any form of discussion. And I think in the pre-war years, this proved a problem, because of course it meant completely dodging the issue of women's suffrage or Irish independence. And then when you look at in the wartime period, I mean, as magnificent as J.T. Murphy's pamphlet, The Workers' Committee, was, the irony is that the imperialist war, which is the context around which shop stewards organisation is formed in the engineering factory, is completely missed out and is not taken on. In other words, syndicalism didn't provide a political alternative pole of attraction to the existing Labour leaders. And again, I think Russia was to prove, just a couple of other things. The conception that somehow a revolutionary general strike would inevitably lead to workers being able to cease to overthrow the capitalist class came up against the problem of what would inevitably be the violent resistance of the state to attempt to defend the economic and political system. And again, it contrasted with the sort of Bolsheviks' view that the workers' control over production would be impossible until after the overthrow of the existing state and its replacement by an alternative state. And October of 1917 was to show, to demonstrate this in practice. And the final problem, I think, with the syndicalist tradition, which helps explain the transition, is the role of a combat political party. I mean, the pre-war syndicalists saw parties as either unnecessary or at worst as a handicap to the working class. Many of the members of the socialist organisations in the wartime period, influenced by syndicalist ideas, that because they believed in party, they were members of a party, but they essentially saw it as an auxiliary propaganda outlet for purely industrial activity. And in a sense, they didn't have a conception of a Bolshevik type party. But you know, to be honest, syndicalists were not alone in this. Many socialists around the world didn't understand or didn't appreciate because there had been no experience of an organisation that would bring together on a centralised fashion, an organisation that brings together some of the best militants, but then intervene in workers' struggles to try to give a lead, and economic struggles with a fight more politically. It's only in the Russian Revolution, it was the experience of the Bolshevik Party and the way in which the Communist International brought this together that helped to lead to this radical reorientation that I mentioned, which explains why, when you look at the National Administrative Committee of the Shop Stewards Movement, no less than 6 out of the 8 members joined the Communist Party when it was set up. So in conclusion, my argument, I suppose, is that the syndicalists made, I think, a fantastically important contribution. We stand on the shoulders of that tradition in terms of their analysis of bureaucracy, their advocacy of rank and file activity, their attempt to explore the ways in which unions could play a role in this. I think, it was an admirable tradition. In truth, though, the tradition is one that is superseded by a Marxist tradition, which became embodied in, I'm not saying there weren't subsequently all sorts of problems with the Communist Party, and we can discuss that in discussion. But insofar as the Communist Party, its traditions really absorbed and further advanced, what the syndicalists were trying to do, I think, this was clearly what happened.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Really? Your turn?
Is it okay if I stay seated? I can sit. Anyway, I know, sorry. Well, I thought I was going to have to disagree with a lot of what Ralph said, but I haven't disagreed. I have agreed with a lot of it. And I'm not exactly going to do what you said I was going to do. What I want to look at is that, although we've seen that the syndicalist heyday was in 1910 to 14, although I think it actually did continue World War I, certainly after 1917. I really want to look at it in its a wider historical context. Why syndicalism? And I want to argue that there are 3 main reasons or 3 factors explaining why syndicalism dominated the movement, at least in those 4 years, and was eventually superseded, as Ralph said, by political organisation, particularly the communist one. So I think there are 3 factors. One, what you have to look at is the strength of British trade unions, massive strength of British trade unions by this time, including unions amongst unskilled and semi-skilled workers. That period of new unionism, really from the 1880s onwards. Secondly, and this runs counter to this, and that is the weakness of Marxism in Britain. That is a critical factor, which I want to come back to. And thirdly, the influence of, because we didn't have a strong Marxist tradition, unfortunately, what did dominate politically was liberalism, and later the Labour Party, and liberalism, I'll explain later, was, well, I think probably you all know what it is, but this was really dominated the philosophy of the Labour Party, really from when it was formed as the Labour Representation Committee, when it did deals with the Liberal Party so that it could stand working class candidates in liberal areas, and the Liberals would stand down and so on. So what I'm really talking about is that there was an ideological, very, very strong ideological tradition of reformism rather than a revolutionary tradition in Britain. But I need to explain why I think that was. And basically, I think the only way to understand those three factors is to place it in the context, really, of the dominant force of British imperialism and British social imperialism. Basically, although I said trade unions were very strong in Britain, which they were, the socialist movement, which was beginning to resurrect itself in the 1880s, was caught on the tidal wave of imperialist hysteria and was weakened by it. So when I say that the Marxist tradition wasn't strong, in most European countries, for example, in Germany, you did see a strong Marxist tradition. Britain, as an imperialist country, almost succeeded in strangling this little tiny birth of Marxism in the 1880s. Why was this the case? It's not just by accident. Why is an ideology, or the ruling ideas in any society, those of the ruling class, the dominant ideas, and imperialism really caught the imagination, not imagination, but it was certainly a massive factor. And of course, that means racism as well. Now, racism had underpinned slavery, it wasn't a new phenomenon. But my argument is there was a much wider platform for the divisive ideas of racism and racial superiority from the 1880s onwards because of the expanded ideological operation of the state. In other words, by the 1880s, education, at least elementary education, was free and compulsory, so you had literacy. That also meant that there was the growth of the popular press, which of course, as you know, what the popular press always does is to really sort of parrot the ruling class ideology in a popular way. And many other forms, for example, imperial ideology has expressed itself through popular culture, through music halls, through working men's clubs and institute unions, through school history and geography textbooks, which I've made a study of actually, and looked at thousands of them, and they are unbelievable. I can quote you and they were standard textbooks. So geography and history basically was it wasn't just the novels of Kipling and Henty, who were probably a bit middle class, but that notion that somehow or other Britain had a right to rule. And it was very important for the ruling class to spread this notion, because who was going to fight for the empire if not workers? And in fact, there was a bit of a problem, because when the Boer War came in 1900, a lot of the recruits were rejected as medically unfit, especially because they had rickets and because they had all sorts. So in other words, this ideology of and the racial superiority that went with it was something which I think really had an impact in diverting workers from the real issue, which meant that Marxism, of course, was kind of strangled. But there was much more to it than that, because apart from the sort of ideological apparatus, there was a wider platform for the volumes of scholarly writings providing some kind of intellectual justification for this. The works of people like Benjamin Kidd and Karl Pearson inventing this so-called science of eugenics. Eugenics was incredibly popular and important. So why am I saying this? And did it really have an impact? Well, I would say that it had a massive impact even on the left. How could I prove this? Well, pro-imperialists appeared as opinion formers on the intellectual left. Fabian Society, for example, was aggressively pro-imperialist. They were all racist. I mean, they just were. It's not kind of like doing them down or being, wise after the event. You only have to read some of, H.G. Wells or Bernard Shaw. I mean, racism was it wasn't a shocking thing. It underpinned the very, notion. Racism, of course, that goes without saying, but that's the product of all forms of class society. Deeply within. The record of the Marxist left so-called Marxist left, was a little better. The Social Democratic Federation, led by Heinemann. I mean, Heinemann supported big Navy policy. Heinemann was some of the theorists were actually racist. I could quote some of them, and your hair would stand on end. This wasn't shocking at the time because that was the dominant culture, the dominant ideology, in the same way that those of us who fought within the women's movement have had to unpick the dominant sexist ideology that's been there within the labour movement for so long. And I'm sure you know what I mean. And the TUC likewise. The TUC, don't forget, by the way, the British Empire was more or less, it's the 1880s. You know, Britain had a head start. It was the only thing that had a real head start in it, because by 1880 the British economy was really under severe attack, and staple industries, which I'll come back to, were in a very bad way. Coal, cotton, and engineering, the industries which had sparked the Industrial Revolution, in inverted commas, were in a very bad way. The biggest, export from Britain from the 1880s onwards was not manufacturing goods, it was capital, because capital goes where the rate of return is the highest, and the rate of return is highest where the rate of exploitation is highest, and that's in the colonies. So the TUC, which was born, as you know, in Manchester, 1868, the British Empire, the expansion of the British Empire went almost unnoticed by the TUC, and they were a little bit concerned about. Well, the only real comment I found actually is during the Boer War, where the TUC was a little bit concerned about Rand Jewish capitalists. Well, that's a bit like, you know, so in other words, it passes as a sort of just passed. So basically, so that's my point about there being no mass Marxist party, that Marxism was on this tidal wave of imperialist hysteria and therefore was weakened by it. So you still got a strong trade union movement. In fact, what we could say is that trade union politics took precedence over socialist politics. In fact, there's very little you can see of socialist politics other than the attempt to have Labour representation in Parliament, which was achieved in 1900, just about, by the formation of the Labour Representation Committee. Not really, the Labour Party didn't even have a constitution until 1918. The Labour Representation Committee was a compromise between a barely established socialist tradition in the form of the Independent Labour Party, which had been formed in 1893, and the older incorporated tradition. Lib Labism, before the Labour Party was formed, was literally that. When working men stood as candidates and were allowed to do so by the Liberal Party, they were Liberal MPs. Now, formally, they could be Labour MPs, but usually the Liberal Party would stand aside for them. I mean, I'm really compressing a big bit of history into a few sentences, but you get my drift. So in other words, what dominated politically was a reformist liberal tradition, which had a little bit of a left wing within it in the form of the Independent Labour Party. I mean, this is not, I'm not kind of dismissing it because it was an important element, but in order to understand, in my opinion, why syndicalism was so strong, you can see that straight away, can't you? Where were the politics? It was the trade unions and the left within the trade unions that almost had no recourse. So the ILP itself sacrificed both its socialism and its independence for the sake of unity. So the end result is the Labour Party as the mass party, the ideology of which can best be described as labourist rather than socialist. And I think they would have described themselves as labourist rather than socialist. So syndicalism, I believe, is the product of class struggle, especially in the staple industries, as an antidote to the failure of labourism. So you can quite understand why militant workers then felt politics was a waste of time. They had to organise on their own. They were wrong, but I can understand why. And I think it's got to be put in this context of this dominant imperialist ideology, social imperialism, which was a big, big thing. You know, support the empire and you'll get cheap bread. I mean, it's all rubbish, but we know that that's most ruling class ideology is. So the key features of syndicalism have been described, I think, by Ralph, so I won't go into it, but to say that Tom Mann, you know, in a way is the link between the syndicalist non-political tradition and the political tradition. He the first person. There were two main issues in conflict with syndicalism. One of the things about dual unionism. Do you write off the whole load of the trade union movement as being one big reactionary mass and form your own? Or do you operate within the existing unions? And Tom Mann certainly was one of them who said you've got to operate within the existing ones. So Tom Mann is, I'm not more about the industrial syndicalist education league because you've done it. But one of the big things was this whole thing about amalgamation. That was an important element of the syndicalist campaign, apart from the quite correct notion, which didn't really take off about industrial unionism. Well, we sort of got it and miles away from it. By the way, syndicalists, it's interesting in this, but because they were contemptuous of the existing political system, they actually attacked the demand for nationalisation. Even railway workers did, because they thought this was the state, you know, capturing its horrible hand on workers and on the movement. Now, the miners' next step is again referred to, but again, you can understand why the miners' next step was written, but it's the classic phrase that was used in the miners' next step when they say, this is Noah Ablett, an industrial vote will affect the lives and happiness of workmen far more than a political vote. Hence, it should be more sought after. I mean, again, I suppose if you were living then and you saw the Labour Party, you know, you'd think, well, actually, that's probably true. But of course, it's not really, as we know. Now, J.T. Murphy, I don't know why, really don't know why the GFTU's republished his pamphlet, because I think J.T. Murphy got it so wrong. Basically, J.T. Murphy really did take up massively this sort of rank and file. Well, it's the rank and file. Leaderships are all a load of rubbish. And I think he also drew very incorrect conclusions from the shop stewards movement of World War One. And I think you can see that there's a syndicalism in the Shop Stewards and Workers' Committee movement that was formed during World War One. And of course, one of the reasons for that was that the entire leadership of almost every single union entered into a pact with the government, you know, the munitions of war agreement and the Treasury agreement saying no strike, we won't go on strike, well, all people will all support the war. But, well, you know, this is where the Shop Stewards movement. Well, shop stewards did exist before, but they were just dues collectors. Now they were the tribunes of the people on the shop floor. So you can see why that could feed into a syndicalist thing. But there was no option. There was no other alternative, no political alternative. But 1917 changed everything. The Russian Revolution, the second Russian Revolution, not the first one. The February Revolution, everyone can say that was fine. We just got rid of the Tsar and we can now, so Kerensky's there. As long as they stay in the war, they'll be fine. It was the Bolshevik Revolution that really changed everything. The October Revolution, when Russia came out of the war, and then all the sort of reformist types who said, okay, get rid of the Tsar, we don't like that sort of thing. That was the real turning point. And actually, with those two things, the Russian Revolution and World War One, that's what split the labour movement. It split everything. It split the women's movement as well. It split the women's movement massively because Sylvia, within one family, it was a microcosm of that split. both those things, socialists opposed World War One. The syndicalists were, as you said, remained a bit silent on that. And the Russian Revolution posed problems because it raised the question of the state, and this was the very issue which syndicalists had well, just ignored. So I'm going to just add to the limitations of syndicalism, that some of the points that you agree with the points that Ralph made, and then just very quickly look at the aftermath. So basically, the silence on the state was really, you can see why the Bolshevik Revolution shattered that. This was workers taking power, workers and peasants, and forming Soviets or workers' councils, which were political. They weren't just there to. They saw the role of the state as key in affecting that. But I would say also that syndicalism was on a very, very narrow base. It was really representing workers in the staple industries, the industries that were most affected by British capitalists' failure to invest in domestic industries in favour of the export of capital, as I said before, overseas and in the colonies where they could reap much. So if you look at the coal was obviously at the centre of this, the mining industry. The only way, coal, cotton and engineering, but the only way that profits could be maintained in those industries was by a massive employer offensive to do either one or both of two things, to extend the working day or to cut wages. And that's, but it's quite right, you can see where syndicalists were very, very prevalent in the mining industry in South Wales and elsewhere. But it's because of that, and because of that base, completely understandable base within those industries which were most affected by a mammoth employer offensive, which was really, really strong after the First World War. But the other huge limitation of syndicalism emerges, and that is its lack of appeal to women. Women were not involved in this at all. Very, you point out some examples, but by and large, really not, really not. And you know, although there was the three big movements came together. Well, they didn't actually come together, but they were in evidence between 1910 and 1914. The struggle for Irish independence, the struggle for the vote for women, and the great unrest. They didn't really come together. Everybody quotes this one example when Sylvia Pankhurst spoke at the Albert Hall on Irish independence, and there were strikers there, and the workers' dreadnought really tried to link these struggles. But I don't think you could say that all those struggles really came together other than in one or two moments. I think if they had it done, there actually could have been a revolution in Britain in 1914, but the First World War saved it for British capitalists to defend the empire. And that's what the First World War was all about. It was the redivision of the British Empire. Whoever won was going to get the majority of Britain, of course, did. And so let's just, so great limitation. I'm not going to add any more to the limitations of syndicalism, but just to say what happened after the First World War. Well, militancy continued after the First World War. The shop stewards and workers' committee movement, was the syndicalism, or was it the inevitable result of trade union abrogation? But so if you look at the Clyde Workers' Committee, which Ralph mentioned, it was highly political, but its limitations were inherent in the fact that it remained just a loose federation of workplace organisations. And in fact, after the Russian Revolution, it was summed up really by, its limitations were summed up by Willie Gallagher himself, when he said that after the 1919 massive strike in Scotland and the big demonstration in Glasgow, he said, we were carrying on a strike when we ought to have been making a revolution. And so the turning really had been reached by revolutionary industrial militants in 1919, which exposed this peculiar British paradox of a mass movement without a political voice and a tiny socialist as opposed to labourist movement without the masses. And this was by now glaringly obvious. This was the key thing, key lesson to learn in 1919. So syndicalism obviously showed itself capable of confronting individual employers, but not able to sustain lasting advances. So the theories of Marx and Lenin, as well as the practical lessons of the Russian and German revolutions, this was really important because it wasn't just the Russian Revolution. It looked as though we're going to do revolutions everywhere. Germany, Hungary, a little bit in Italy, almost, except Mussolini took it over. Nevertheless, they all had to say they were workers' parties, you know, even Mussolini did. Yeah, Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells really like Mussolini. Just shows you. Anyway, this was so the key thing really, this inspirational moment between 1917 and the Communist International was inspirational, and of course it led to the formation of the Communist Party in 1920. Consisting of 4 main organisations, but actually lots of little bits of one came in. But the Workers' Socialist Federation, Sylvia Pankhurst's organisation, the British Socialist Party, which was the purged SDF, really, getting rid of all the nonsense from behind the nights. The Socialist Labour Party, very prominent in Scotland with John Maclean and so on, and the one bit of syndicalism, which was the South Wales Socialist Society, which was really the offshoot of the miners' movement in South Wales. To prove my point about the mass influence of the Russian Revolution, you only have to look at this phenomenal campaign that existed after 1917, 1918, really up until 1922, of mass support for the Russian Revolution. So much so that it even actually resulted in the British government having to change its foreign policy. So you've got the Hands Off Russia movement, you've got these councils of action spreading all over the country, support for the Soviet Russia, absolutely outspokenly. Sylvia Pankhurst establishing the People's Russian Information Bureau, getting all the texts translated from Lenin and smuggled, not smuggled, but they were. And then this Hands Off Russia movement was massive, and it led to dockers refusing to load with Johnny George. Don't forget, after 1917, 14 capitalist countries, led by this country, engaged in wars of intervention against the young Soviet Republic. And these councils of action, and it's interesting, those little councils of action, like little Soviets all around the country, they were massively mobilised, even to the point where actually the TUC had to sit up and take notice. And the result of this was that the British government had to renege on, or had to reverse its policy of launching yet further attacks on the young Soviet Russia. There was even a soldiers' strike. So support this politically was extremely important, and that's what really ensured that the Communist Party, all the militants that you've named, eventually joined the Communist Party in 1920. But the militancy continued after the war. The mines were handed back to the owners. They were briefly kind of not exactly nationalised, but they were taken into some form of state control during the First World War. But this attack on workers continued, and one of the products, I suppose, syndicalist products, was the Triple Alliance, which was rail, mines, and what's the other one? Transport. Yeah, but anyway, yeah. So several major set-piece battles took place. One was in 1921 when the miners were, this is Harmony Fry. They were basically said, you're locked in unless you accept new contracts. And the employers won on that occasion. The solidarity action failed. But in a way, that solidarity action failing to support the miners again raised the question of socialism or reformism. And this is when new forms of workers' organisation began to develop. Haltingly, actually, the Red International Labour Unions, which was a Comintern-inspired organisation, eventually led to the national minority movement being extremely important indeed, which, again, if I just quote from the national minority movement, it wasn't formed until 1924, but this was important because it was prior to the general strike, and I think without it, the general strike might not have occurred. The national minority movement, formed in 1924, explicitly stated it's not a separatist movement. It's there to overthrow capitalism, for the emancipation of workers from their oppressors, and to establish a socialist commonwealth. And it said that it's there to work within existing unions, and it was very successful because by the role of the Communist Party was very important in this, and that meant that the next attack on the miners came in 1925, and when it did come, the work at last, there was a victory of sorts. It was a temporary halt, but Red Friday was when they came again for the miners, and then there was mass solidarity and mass unity, and the government had to step back because they were not ready. And then that period between July 1925, Red Friday, when the workers actually did turn back to government, just temporarily, admittedly, between that date and May 1926, there were preparations made every single day by the government, which, in their own class interests, established their organisation for the maintenance of supplies. They knew this was going to be the big battle, the big battle. But on the other hand, the TUC did virtually nothing, but the National Minority Movement, Communist Party, prepared day in, day out. So the general strike, and we will be celebrating its centenary, we'll celebrate the centenary of Red Friday next year, and then the general strike in 2026. The issue, without, I'm not going to say anything more about general strike that take too long, obviously, but it was so totally crystallised what the issue really was in the general strike. Here was mass support, the biggest strike you can possibly imagine, other than possibly the 1842 general strike in this time. Anyway, that's another one that really should be looked at. And I'm so glad, by the way, that it's not called a plaque, and you've got a plaque in Manchester now, which actually says that it is a strike and not a bloody riot, because it was a proper. So anyway, back to 1926. It's kind of encapsulated in what Baldwin, the Tory Prime Minister, said. He said what was clear to him about the general strike was, to quote him, "Who rules Britain?" And the TUC said, "Not you. We didn't rule Britain." And here you have the classic division between revolutionary socialism and reformism, which in the end sides with capitalism and decides that the state is theirs, not ours. Well, I think I stop there.
Thank you, Mary. Okay, has anyone got any questions from the floor?
If you do ask a question, if you could just say your name and where you're from if you ask a question, because it takes a couple of seconds, but I'll catch up with you.
From Oldham. I think you both described that decline really well. I was wondering what I don't know to start about why it's never kind of resurfaced anyway. Like, I think the Spanish Civil War kind of finalised the decline, or industrial, obviously you described it, but given how like the strength of British trade tends to ebb and flow, why do you think there's never been a sense to kind of rejuvenate syndicalism?
I think it has re-emerged in sort of not exactly a sort of repeat formation as such, but I think there have been occasions towards the end of the 20th century when we've seen movement. Don't use the language, don't describe themselves as syndicalists, and they're not in a formal syndicalist organisation, but in terms of their inner dynamic and content, have much of those attributes. I mean, one example was Solidarność in Poland in 1980 to 81. And I think the reason for it was for similar reasons as to why, as Meredith described, syndicalism emerged at the beginning of the century, which was, if you think about Poland, it was a communist country, so-called, but I mean, it was with the state control over apparatus over the society. There were massive internal problems. The trade unions were almost like a transition belt towards the Communist Party. There were no real serious independent political forms of organisation. And so when the movement exploded, the Gdansk and Gdynia and so on, you had a movement which really was a trade union movement, but which wanted to be non-political. Essentially, they feared to have a direct political sort of, arm to their, as a weapon, because they wanted to have a sort of self-limiting revolution. That they used the mass strike, used mass forms of union organisation as a mechanism from which to try to push reforms. And inherently, it was it seemed to me it was a revolutionary form of unionism. Another example would be in South Africa under apartheid, where you have sort of so-called workers' movements, which also, in a sense, as opposed to the ANC's political sort of military tradition, they wanted to look towards the power of the working class within the mines and the point of production. But also, try to avoid, direct sort of political issues. And I think there are other examples around the world, in South America as well. So, there've always been small, little, tiny groups that regard themselves as syndicalists, and the sort of anarchist tradition, anarcho-syndicalist tradition, has those. But I think you can see the way in which, again, in a much more diffuse fashion, but the idea that you believe in workers' militancy, you believe in industrial struggle, but you don't want to get involved in the sort of inter-cyanide sort of warfare that goes on amongst, radical set groups, then you put all the emphasis on trade unionism. It has that sort of resonance. So, it was a product of its time, but it's the historical content which Murray's, described. But it's not one which, hasn't had echoes, I think, in other, more contemporary times.
Well, only to say that the trade union struggle isn't necessarily progressive or political, and Solidarność is a very good example of that. It was virulently anti-Semitic and turned out to be a most reactionary force. So it might have used the mass strike, but I don't know what it used it for. It wasn't for any good purpose, as far as I can see.
Wait.
I quick reflection on that. It's come up, but then question as well. I had a recent interaction with, I think, one of the kind of success events of Solidarność. It was an international meeting of education unions looking at in a workshop on opposing the privatisation of education. Actually, it was a really interesting kind of clash of conversations because it started from they came in very strongly with a perspective that privatisation of education was fundamental to democracy, which kind of threw the whole European conversation about how you resist privatisation out, because obviously they're more. So in some ways, I would maybe argue less syndicalism, more a kind of right liberal social democratic kind of model of privatisation, etc. That some of ours was eventually aiming at, but the more substantive point, the reason I originally put my hand up the question was, I'm interested in that question of syndicalism today, but less so with maybe some of the examples that have been discussed. I go on something Ralph said a minute ago about the syndicalism today, the same ideas don't necessarily express themselves with the same words. They define themselves as syndicalism or define themselves as. I was really struck by the fact both of you really focused on syndicalism as being what happens when you get trade union revolt and radicalism, but without political dimension. So that the politics is missing from it. And I think that's a really interesting context today when some unions, in response to what has been quite a bleak outlook politically, with political parties turning away from trade union demands, etc. Some unions have returned to this kind of the workplace versus politics, workplace versus Westminster, back to trade union struggle rather than that. And that's something I think is a really interesting concept. To what extent do we see bits of syndicalism being replaced today because of a fatalism about the ability of mainstream politics to solve some of the issues of trade unions today? Sorry, it's a long-winded question, but
Not sure the question was.
How do we see those sort of ideas that you've been talking about now being replaced today when it's not the absence of a political movement, but many people in the trade union movement have given up on political answers to their questions and sort of returned to the idea when it's just about workplace struggle. But that's all the limitations you both just described.
I think I know what you and you're thinking of as well. But I don't think there's anything wrong at all in concentrating on the workplace. In fact, I think that's the problem, but that actually doesn't happen nearly enough. You have to build from the base up. And if we did more of that, we'd have a much stronger trade union movement. But I don't think a trade union movement is a political movement. I think trade unions are there to be trade unions. And at their most, this is the issue, the real question of trade union consciousness, socialist consciousness, or revolutionary consciousness. And trade unions, I think, are schools of communism in the sense that they bring people together. I'm talking about communism in the broadest possible way, not in the sectarian way, in the sense that they bring workers together in a common struggle. You learn through that common struggle. And I think syndicalism itself, and I forgot to say this, I think it represents one of the highest forms of trade union consciousness. Not necessarily socialist consciousness, but I think that from that struggle you can get socialist consciousness, and that means you have to have a political party of the working class reflecting those struggles. So trade unions, in a sense, well, the French word for a trade union is syndic. That's what it is. It should be, but that doesn't mean that therefore you elevate that struggle beyond the. Well, we've seen what happens if you can't get socialism just through trade union struggle. You have to understand the question of the state. But I think that's the most advanced form then of trade union consciousness, which then sees the importance of linking up all the different struggles for what? Not just to have more trade union struggles, but actually to change the nature of society. That's not totally an answer to your question, but anyway, that's my how I see it.
Okay, we haven't had many questions online because I believe we've had problems with the sound. Oh. Yeah. So apologies to anyone who's still online and you can hear me. But we've had one question. Now, this question is a whole session in itself, by the way, yeah, but we'll ask you, yeah, okay. So this is from Alan Shaw, and he says the 1970s was a period of militancy and trade union power. Eric Hobsbawm produced his book, The Forward March of Labour Halted. Today, trade union membership is halved. So what it was when he wrote the book, has capitalism won?
Well, of course, he was wrong, of course, and because basically the night, yeah, this is a very important question actually, because what happened in 1974? I mentioned that in the 1920s how the strength of the movement forced the Tory government to change its foreign policy in relation to Russia. 1974, the strength of the movement forced the Tory government out of office. And so what was the strength of that movement? What did it actually mean? Well, as you know, in 1979, that was the highest form of trade union membership. We're just gone down since then. But so what was the key to that success? The key to that success in the 70s was a massive rank and file organisation called the Liaison Committee for the Defence of Trade Unions, which was, I have to say, this is masterminded by the Communist Party. And what was the essence of in a way, the Liaison Committee for the Defence of Trade Unions was, I see it's a little bit similar to the National Minority Movement. It did not seek to break away. It did not pose rank and fileism against leadership. On the contrary, it worked within unions to ensure that there were actually progressive and socialist leaders. So that, for example, then in the Amalgamated Engineering Union, Hugh Scanlon, who was a very good left-winger. In the Transport General Union, Workers' Union, Jack Jones, and there were others as well. And the importance of the engineering union, Tom Mann's union actually, was very important. But just a little aside, I have to say this, because it was in the AU, and it was with the support of the AU, that women won their first equal pay dispute. I'm talking about the Trico strike, which was absolutely fully supported by the Engineering Workers Union. It was an incredible moment, I think. People seem to forget about this, but you know, this union, the AU, didn't admit women as members until 1946. But anyway, coming back to, I forgot what I was saying. Yeah, so coming back to 1974, this did see this massive uprising. Now, then 79 came, Thatcher, and this is when Hobsbawm wrote that article, and everybody, including the Communist Party, it has to be said, suddenly said, oh, the forward march of labour is halted, we have to have a new new approach, new realism. It's a sort of form of new realism, and the term Thatcherism was developed. And this form of new realism really undermined the left then totally, and it led to this dreadful period in British politics, in which the Tories, who had planned it all beforehand, well before, you just look at their private papers, it's unbelievable. They just knew what they were going to do. They learned the lesson from Heath, who tried to introduce one piece of anti-union legislation. The Tories did it by stealth through 12 separate pieces of. So the trade unions were smashed. In other words, the class enemy knows their strength much better than we do, and they prepare for it. And our movement, when Hobsbawm and others, Marxism Today actually was saying this, that the forward march of labour is halted, they said that basically we are defeated already. And that then meant that the leadership of most unions then totally, the organising model was gone, and now trade unions were just the consumerist model, you know, and relied on everything from the European Union, oh, we've got social Europe, they'll give us all our rights, we can all sit back, and the movement was smashed. But does that mean that they were right? It doesn't mean that at all. But we're having to pick up the pieces in our day from that and to rebuild again. And we have to, because I'm not answering the question, am I? I don't think. I'm just not on harangue. I'm sorry, but Ralph, you tell me like
You've spoken about.
what?
You've spoken about this way. I forgot when the capitalism was what.
Well, they haven't been. No, they've had a chance. The way I see Labour history is there's peaks and troughs, and the strength of the movement doesn't automatically respond just to the economic things. It's really the consciousness of people that determines our social being. And that's the key thing, is building that consciousness. And today it's building a united front, it's doing all of those things, learning the mistakes of the past. So I see the 80s as a trough where the class enemy, and they were the class enemy, they knew how to win. They knew that they could only succeed, and it was all planned. I can tell you, I've seen all these Thatcher papers well beforehand, so how do you win? You strike at the head. You strike at the best organised. So you get rid of the miners, the printers, and the dockers. They were the unions that were the strongest, and everything else will then fall into pieces. And you make sure that you have some class enemies operating within the trade union movement, like the electricians union. You know who I'm talking about. Yes. But it was planned, and we planned nothing. So what do we learn from that? Plan. We've got to plan, and we've got to understand what the enemy is, and how we regroup, how we get rid of sectarianism, how we should build industrial unions. But that's another story.
Ralph, do you want to come on?
Yeah. First of all, I want to just comment on Poland, because we're different. For me, certainly between 1980 to 81, afterwards, of course, solidarity became completely reactionary in many respects, and as you say, argue for privatisation and so on. But in the period before the military coup, this was an inherently revolutionary form of organisation. Last meetings relayed to the workers, a social movement as well as a trade union movement, raised all sorts of fundamental questions. I dispute the notion that somehow, of course, the CIA supported solidarity, but that doesn't make it a CIA outfit. It was a genuinely proper. I want to address myself to what can we learn about syndicalism as some relevance, and I want to comment on some of the points that I'm going to differ with Mary. You see, because the thing about syndicalism, in a sense, it came up against the limits of unionism. Of the idea that you can transform existing organisations such as unions into a revolutionary form. And Mary's absolutely right. Engels argued that unions are potentially schools of communism, but he only thought that when they were on the rise in struggle. Because Engels condemned unions as being completely corrupt and bureaucratic and so on earlier than before the new unionist period. And Marx also didn't read his writings on unions. It differs depending on the sort of period. So unions have an inherent potential to have radical aspirations, to want to change society and so on. But for a lot of the time, particularly in the troughs, they're sectionalist, they're bureaucratic, they're very preoccupied, parochial in their interests, and so on. And that's why this is what. And this tension between them, I think, comes all the time. The syndicalists, I think one of the key problems with them is the question of bureaucracy. And, when you read the Miners' Next Step and you look at the Workers' Committee panel, the appreciation of bureaucracy, the existence of a strata of officials at the top of the union machine, and the role which that plays. Of course, sometimes they can be progressive, but also they can act in a fashion of, to contain worker struggles, is one that the syndicalists attempted to grapple with. Now, when the Communist Party was formed, it too grappled with this problem. It too was concerned about the problem with bureaucracy and building from below. The problem is that in the period of the 20s, the potential for rank and file organisation and the way in which the syndicalists had advocated, really the ground had been pulled from underneath them because of the slump, the economic slump, the counter-offensive from employers and so on. And I think there was a real problem there, how you can maintain that type of form of organisation in the context which is hostile to you. And I think, so that was a domestic pressure. But I mean, the minority movement didn't retain, actually had a sort of rank and filist dimension, but it also had an orientation towards the officials as well. And, I don't want to complicate it, but there was the influence of the Anglo-Russian Committee on the leadership of the Communist Party to sort of fudge differences with the trade union officials, which I don't think helped particularly. And then I think when we come to the 1970s, I mean, Osborne did make one point about the 1970s, which it was syndicalism without syndicalists. Quite an important article he once wrote. And I think there was a truism of that in that sense, in terms of, in other words, even in the period of mass struggles, it doesn't necessarily, of course, there's the potential for workers to develop in terms of more radical consciousness and so on, but without, some form of organisation there that can help direct that, it's not automatically to follow. But I think also, I mean, the liaison committee was not a replica of the shop stewards' forms of organisation. I mean, Mary's right in the sense that it attempted to forge an alliance with full-time officials. The problem was that if you're trying to influence left officials and to woo their influence, and the danger is that you avoid raising difficult sort of questions with them, and therefore, I think that can be a problematic feature.
Okay. I think we've just got time for one more question. So we've got one more question online, if that's okay. And this actually is a question that's actually relevant to what we were just talking about. And also an interesting question from anyone involved in trade union education as well. So it says in Ralph's book, The Labour Revolt, he explores the role of radical education ideas via the Plebs League, etc. So would it be fair to say there was a rapid growth of radical approaches to work-class education in the 1910s, and how important the speakers think this was?
Then, how important was that?
Yeah. Was.
Did you want to? No. I mean, I think the Plebs League was magnificent. But I don't know if everyone's familiar with it. It was, became sort of very much syndicalist influenced. There were different ideas, helping to shape that from America, but also from Britain. At its heart was the notion of industrial unionism, but what it wanted to do, it came out of a revolt that took place at the Ruskin working class sort of education, residential college, when young students, particularly miners and railmen, argued that the management were trying to restrict the curriculum which was aimed at looking at industrial sort of economics. And there were mainly trade union delegates that had been sent, paid by their unions to, working class sort of education, but were not wanting to look at sort of broader, the way in which capitalism really operates, its exploitative nature and broader political issues. And so the students revolted, and as a consequence of that, formed this body called the Plebs League, which then developed on a national level and aimed to provide political education for young working class activists in different schools and so on. And it had, you know, tremendous success. There were groups formed right across the country. And in South Wales, in the Rhondda, there were about 3 different groups. They could have meetings and 50, 100 militants that would attend them. There were, and many of the people who went through the training of the Pledge League subsequently became leading sort of trade union sort of figures. The idea that there should be political education, independent political education, about the nature of capitalism, about the history of workers' struggles, about the tactical and strategic issues which we confront in the movement. I mean, of course, that's absolutely crucial. So, I mean, I think they played, that contributed. It was part of the milieu of the radical left. And there were lots of crossovers, because some of them were members of syndicalist organisations, some of them were members of socialist organisations, some of them were non-aligned. Some of them were involved with the suffrage movement and so on. So, you know, but insofar as it made a contribution, made a very important contribution. But I think it's one that, you know, we can replicate today. I mean, in a sense, this very meeting, you know, which GFTU have organised, is very important. It's part of that tradition, isn't it? Trying to have discussions. In this sense, this is about labour history. But I mean, there needs to be, you know, a greater attention paid to politically educating trade union activists about the world in which we live, and trying to integrate not only their concerns about the particular industry that they work in and their union structures, and how to learn to develop skills of being a negotiator and into bargain and so on and so forth, but also to discuss about what's going on in Palestine and how that relates to trade union activity, about environmental issues and climate and so on, and to have broader political concerns. I mean, that type of political education you don't get at school, and you're not going to get it often in political parties like the Labour Party, and therefore to have some forms of independent political tradition of that sense, I think, you know, it makes it is important to continue that tradition.
Okay, do you want the last word, Mary? We're just over time.
Well, I think there's quite a few of us here who've been involved in trade union education, and I have all my working life actually, but I think there are problems, and the TUC is a very good example of the problems that there are, because I think there's just been a reversion to functionalism rather than really encouraging people workers to become the vanguard of their own class, really, and that means that there has to be education of a new type, and the problems that have beset the movement throughout its history, reformism versus socialism, are there and apparent in trade union education, right from the Pledge League onwards, and certainly having been involved in TUC education for really for a long time, I can see the way that has whittled down into, you know, the contentless course. And I see Les smiling, you know exactly what I mean. You can't use this stuff anymore. It's just awful. So what we try to do when we established trade union studies, this is just a small example, is to have a ladder of opportunity for workers from shop stewards courses right up until PhDs. And we wrote the courses, and some unions, but of course we met the crisis of higher education, which has now become totally commodified. So that's why Marks Memorial Library and Workers' School wants to continue that tradition, and it has done it since 1933. This is a plug for us, but it's also illustrating, I think, the problems that, you know, we overtly give a Marxist analysis of whatever we're doing. And I mean, that's not fixed in stone, because we have to question everything. And that's what workers have to, everybody, that's the whole point of education. So I think it's vitally important, but there's far too little of it, and far too little the tradition. The National Council of Labour Colleges was very good. The TUC took it over and ruined it. But there you go. I mean, we still need to dig where we stand, and we still, you know, we have to dig where we stand. We don't invent the world, we have to inherit it as it is, but we have to do the best we can. But education, I think, is absolutely, what do we say? What's our slogan? agitate, educate, organise, or the other way around. Educate, organise, agitate. Oh, I don't know, whatever way around you want it. The three things have got to go together beyond functionalism.
Okay. So can I just thank those people for the contributions. Apologies again to those people online, if there's anyone still left. Okay, just so thank you for all coming tonight. I hope you got something from it. The next event, by the way, by the GFTU is online only, and Mary, I think you planned this, didn't you? Leeds had just gone to, because it's about the general strike in 1926, yeah, and it's by John Foster who's going to be leading that, yeah. So that's on the 16th of January at 7 p.m. Can I also mention, by the way, the day before we are starting a trade union history course here in the Working Class Movement Library. There is still a few places left on it if you want to join us. Yeah, okay. See Nathan or look at the website. And that's it. Thanks for coming. Cheers.
Yeah.